Hello and welcome back to the Godot community. My name is Sahira Dean. I'm the virtual PLC lead for high school 2D art. In today's webinar, I wanted to talk about and kind of go through a few mini projects. Some of these are not necessarily short, but they're more fun. And kids might go through them faster than they might, say something that they don't find as interesting. These might be really good ideas for right before spring break. So maybe you have 2 or 3 weeks before spring break, you want to get something in, or even after they come back from a break or right before, winter break or something like that. So I wanted to just kind of showcase a few and then talk about some things we did. So one thing I'm really fond of is projects that really encourage experimentation and really kind of moving around the classroom. These might be better for your upper level classes. So maybe you have a Draw Paint 3 or 4, or maybe even AP students right before they start their sustained investigation work. So students that you don't mind necessarily going into your art closet or your art supply closet, and students that you can trust putting things back where they go, of course. So I had an experimentation week where I had different stations kind of set up around the room, and at each station was a different prompt. So one was here where they had to try to recreate rust using tea or coffee or brown watercolor. So they had to treat the paper in a certain way to recreate the feeling of rust. And then on the right, another station was to use spray paint to create some type of landscape. In that, they had to create stencils that they might use in their particular landscape. And so you can see, the stencil, was the 2 planets. So we created 2 different ones there. And then he went in with some different techniques to create the landscape. Another station was for students to just use mostly geometric forms, shapes, to create a landscape. So with that in mind, the medium for this station was open. So it looks like she used mostly markers or alcohol markers. But they had to simplify a typical landscape, and this was actually my AP student or my AP class before they started their SSI, just to get them to thinking about another way to create a landscape, a way to create an abstract work of art. Before they dove into what their SSI was. For this one, they had to use oil pastel and I believe it was baby oil or some type of oil, cooking oil, to create, I don't think I specified landscape in particular, but I believe she did 2 different landscapes for hers. But it was a way just to kind of experiment with different media. And then another one was to, use blind or continued line to create different self-portraits. So this I actually got from a teacher in a Facebook group, and this was actually during the COVID period. I'm going to move my bubble a little bit so you can see. So she shared a bunch of prompts that were really, really good. They had a lot of really good information on the slide. And again, this was during the virtual teaching years. So a lot of that stuff that we did and that was shared by teachers make really good mini lessons. So kind of don't throw those away, but kind of think about some of those that you did that might work. You might have to beef it up a little bit. But nonetheless, this PowerPoint was shared, and it had a bunch of different sketchbook prompts. So with this one, they're focusing on line. The artist of inspiration is Egon Chalet, which of course he does have, some controversial imagery and topics, so you want to tread carefully with what you share. So there's a warning there. But nonetheless, that was the artist that she chose. And of course, you can also replace the artist with another one. So this is some of their experimentations that they did. One which could actually go into another project. So I haven't taught this lesson actually in a few years, but students had a lot of fun with this lesson. And what I'm thinking about doing is actually having them experiment with the previous prompt before they go into this lesson. So it has to do with mark making, experimentation, and things like that, to create essentially a composition featuring hands, abstract hands. So this was a very successful lesson, and it was one of the first lessons that we did of the semester before they really got down into the actual, first unit and stuff like that. But it was a really good icebreaker lesson. So here's another prompt, and this was another thing that I did during COVID. So they had to use ink, which is ballpoint pen, to design a birdhouse for a robotic bird. So this might come before they do perspective, so that way you can kind of see where they are. Or it could be a perspective project. So like after you've done all the time intense experimentation with boxes and, whatever that looks like for you and your students, it could be a way that they design their own robotic bird house, or a bird house for a robotic bird. But it was a fun lesson, a fun mini lesson that they really seemed to enjoy, during that COVID period. All right, so another idea, and this is something that will really just kind of help, if you need a moment where maybe students you feel like they need to get out of the classroom, maybe they have a lot of energy, right before break. But taking them to either the gym, or if you have a dance class, or just even if you have a teacher friend that won't mind you coming in, depending on the size of your class, but won't mind you coming in and just kind of sitting and drawing their students. So this was gesture drawing activity I did with my intro class. And they really, really enjoyed this. It made them really feel, like artists. They really got into it. So I did some preliminary drawing in class just to kind of show them some basic techniques. And then we went and spent most of the day in the gym to draw. Shoes is kind of a classic, but a good one. So if you don't have like a little closet of just random things, consider, especially if you're new to teaching, consider, just kind of starting a bin or two of random things you can use for still life, especially shoes. So you can put like an all call out to your school. You can go to the thrift store, your old shoes, your kids' old shoes. But shoes make really, really interesting still lifes. And, so you can break it into contour line. It could be more sophisticated where they're adding value and dimension. But definitely think about keeping some random things in your closet that you can use for still life. Food is a really fun one. So for this project, I had students take their own pictures of different meals they ate, maybe in a weekend or, for dinner. They submitted those and turned those in, or they, kind of edited them and turned them in. So this was watercolor. And watercolor, of course, can be a little bit challenging because I found that students tend to use it like they would acrylic paint. One thing that students really, really enjoy is doing, from my experience, is doing kind of watercolor studies where they're experimenting with the medium. So if you take watercolor pencils and you use sandpaper and sand those over like wet watercolor and see how they absorb into the medium, doing different wax resist or, wet into wet, wet on dry. But doing an experimentation with the medium makes them a little bit more excited for the actual project, I found. So this was actually a really fun one that I'd recommend. Charcoal, of course, is a really good classic one. In your box of collected materials or, still life objects, consider metallic objects, glasses, old candle holders, things like that. But charcoal, is a medium that can be messy, but I found most students really tend to really get into it, especially if you have students that are really into 3D and drawing. I found they really, really enjoy really getting into the charcoal. This is a classic one also that I got from, specifically, I mean, I've seen it around. Of course, you've seen it around a lot, but I specifically got it from one of my mentors, Kevin Cole. He loves doing fabric with students. But really, this is a really good skill for students to learn because it can be kind of tricky. But essentially, once they kind of figure out, oh, it's just a value scale going light to dark kind of on top of the fold, they really, really get into rendering fabric, I've found. Another one using just one or two pieces of food. So this was a spaghetti elbow macaroni noodle that she repeated and repeated and repeated. And this can get into, almost like a zen-like, kind of feeling for students because it does have to do with repetition, and they can just kind of activate a page or two just with that same object, leaving no negative space. So it could be something with graphite or it could be ink, or even colored pencil, honestly, but these tend to turn out really successful as well. Allowing students to experiment with materials they wouldn't normally draw on. So cardboard, students really, really get into drawing on cardboard, I found, especially if you are giving them some skills in terms of, showing the corrugation, kind of using that in the drawing, so peeling away layers, even burning the cardboard, gessoing the cardboard, dry brushing, limiting it to just one medium, like this student did here on the right. It's just Sharpie and ink. But allowing them to experiment with materials other than just paper, I found awakens a new excitement. And then of course, depending on how big the paper is, it can go as quick or as long as you would like it to. This one is kind of an old classic, a classic but goodie, where they morph an object into something else. So I had students kind of brainstorm just by sketching, objects that they're interested in, and then a little mini exercise where they had to, kind of morph the object into something else. So you can see this student went with the yin yang symbol and then kind of transition it into the koi fish, which was pretty successful. So something where they're, you want them to think, want them to experiment. And then, they're essentially kind of creating their own composition. Yes, they have a guideline, but they're creating their own project in some ways because it can look as how they want it to look. So you could give them criteria in terms of you need 4 different transitions. It could span over into 6 if you'd like it to, but again, it depends on your time frame that you have. Visual verbal journal prompts. If you've been with me for a little while, I'm a big fan of VBJs. So giving them a prompt or two around the break. So you could give them some criteria and then, it's up to them to research and come up with their own composition. So it becomes something, again, that they're really interested in, and it allows that experimentation factor that I've been talking about. So this is more kind of project geared as we kind of conclude this presentation. So value paintings, this was another project I did during COVID, to where they're painting directly on top of a photocopy. So they're having to mimic the values in the photo, and then so they did one black and white, and then they did one monochromatic, where they introduced the color. So before this, they of course painted a value scale. They painted a monochrome scale depending on what paint they had available at home or what color they wanted to do. And so it became whatever was in, value 1, 2 became the monochrome color they put in that particular place. So it was a really fun activity. Didn't take a whole lot of time, especially once they kind of understood, oh, this value represents this in color. So sometimes it is hard to see values when you're talking about color. A paper strip portrait. This was one I didn't expect students to really get into. And again, you can see the students are at home. So this was during COVID. But this is honestly one that I may do again on a larger scale. Or maybe they have, different strips they do. I'm not exactly sure how I'm going to do it yet. But the students had a lot of fun. Even my students that weren't as active, in terms of really kind of putting forth, a lot of energy into projects, got into this project as well. So you can see one student chose to do hers on a mask, which I was like, go for it. But this is one that didn't take a whole lot of time. I did do this with my Draw Paint 3-4 students. So they did understand, paint and color, a little bit. So kind of keep that in mind when you're kind of doing these projects. You could also simplify it into being just a pencil or ink drawing if you have students that don't understand color just yet as well. So this project actually, they did in correlation with an art show that we had up. It was a pop art show. So they had to create stencils. You can kind of see the stencils here. And again, this really got them up and out their seats. It got them moving around. At the time, I had a patio, so they could just go and use the patio. I had spray paint. You could do a reverse dye. So if you take like a black shirt and kind of spray it with bleach, of course, this would definitely have to be done outside in a well-ventilated area. And you definitely want to prep students ahead of time if you're doing any kind of bleach. That way they're not wearing their best clothes, or they, can bring a change of clothes. But this one was definitely a lot of fun because it got students into fashion design in some ways. So you can see students really got into it, as they kind of layered with the different spray paints. So thank you so much for tuning in to today's webinar. Again, my name is Sahira Dean, Virtual PLC Lead for High School 2D Art. I do hope you'll join me on the Godot community, where we do talk about different ideas. We share ideas. You can do this with teachers from across the state of Georgia. You can also join other communities. So thank you so much for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. Bye, you guys.